collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up on the programme this week, a high-level conference on energy brings a wealth of experts to the island, and it's not going to be all plain sailing for Cyprus' energy aspirations.
And that's the big problem. Prices are low and the new infrastructure that will be needed is very expensive, and it's not clear how you would make profits.
The government's plans for exporting LNG may not bear fruit.
I don't think there is any realistic prospect of LNG in Cyprus for export for an awful long time.
Turkey and Russia are big players in the region.
Turkey remains an important market for Russian gas. It could also become an important transit country once the pipeline from Azerbaijan is operational sometime in 2020.
And what is the role of renewables in the energy mix?
The Southeast Europe in general is probably the richest area of Europe of renewable energy.
We'll also hear about the Cyprus collection at the British Museum.
You can see some of the finest pottery, jewellery, glass, ivory work made in the Eastern Mediterranean in antiquity.
And Cypriot Tioelinas finishes his first season in the British Porsche Carrera Cup series with a podium.
So then concentrate just to stay with the top guys.
The Prio Cyprus Centre organised a conference on Eastern Mediterranean energy moving forward. One of the keynote speakers was Jonathan Stern from the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. He joins us now. So what were you covering? Because it was a very wide-ranging conference, I think.
It was indeed. I was covering global gas developments and the impact on East Mediterranean oil and gas development. And what I was trying to say to the audience was that, particularly for gas, the commercial environment is becoming much more complicated, and this is going to make it difficult for East Mediterranean gas to find markets outside of its immediate region.
Well, does that put paid to this idea of our area pumping in towards European energy security?
I'm afraid it makes that very, very complicated. I mean, you would never say never, but it makes it seem like this is a distant prospect. And in some ways it would be better if East Mediterranean gas holders concentrated on the region itself. Now, of course, there are difficult politics there, but you haven't got this real big problem of how you transport gas very long distances and sell it in very competitive market conditions.
Yeah, because the price is one of the big problems, isn't it? Particularly when, like Cyprus, you haven't yet got the infrastructure in place.
And that's the big problem. Prices are low and the new infrastructure that will be needed is very expensive, and it's not clear how you would make profits by actually delivering gas at current price levels, or even price levels which are somewhat higher.
Of course, nobody really knows what the future holds, but there is, in the motor industry certainly, a huge movement towards alternative vehicles, electro-hybrids and so on, which could mean that the price of gas and oil and so on drops even further, so it's almost not worth risking leaving it there much longer if the price is going to continue falling, is it?
I think that the vehicle market is a big threat to oil. It's not such a big threat to gas, as we don't really use gas in the transportation sector, although that could change in relation to shipping. But I think the key thing for East Mediterranean gas holders to understand is if you want to monetize this gas soon, it would probably be better to look at opportunities within the region rather than bank on long pipelines or very expensive LNG export terminals to do it for you.
Now, Egypt has quite a lot of infrastructure lying idle and is pretty well next door to Cyprus. Is that the direction we should be looking in?
That's a possible direction. The difficulty is that you still have to build a pipeline between your gas and the terminals, which is probably several €100 million. Then you have some political risks on how will the environment evolve. But the key thing is Egypt has a lot of its own gas, and in time it may want to use those terminals for its own gas rather than entertain other East Med gas for it.
So is the answer for Cyprus, if we do ever find quantities of hydrocarbons that could be useful, to use it in Cyprus for generating power?
That's what I would strongly urge people to look at gasifying the island. And there you could talk about not just power, you could talk about transport as well. An island is an ideal place for gasification of the transport sector. So that would be my suggestion. Use your own fuel rather than importing diesel at almost certainly higher prices.
And paying European fines as well very soon.
Precisely.
Well, we've been talking to one of the keynote speakers at that recent conference on Eastern Mediterranean energy. He is Jonathan Stern from the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies. Another speaker at that conference on energy was John Roberts, an energy security specialist who's based in Scotland. You're an expert in particularly, I think, the politics and energy connection. How would you sum it up? Because these are very troubled times.
This is a very difficult region, and it's also a very difficult economic background. Right now, you've got the potential for a considerable resource in the region. After all, there have already been major discoveries by both Israel and Egypt, and indeed Cyprus has its own Aphrodite field, and even though there has been the failure of the Total drilling, there are still hopes that more will be discovered. But the prospects for actually getting anything to market are incredibly difficult. If Cyprus concentrates on its own market, yes, gas can be very important. It can help improve the climate here. It can provide a form of relatively cheap domestic energy, and indeed could possibly contribute towards the improvement of relations between both parts of the island, since any gas development that covers the Greek section can very easily be extended to cover the northern Turkish populated area as well. But the key point is that the chances for exports are not very good. The only obviously realistic prospect is simply to find a way of getting whatever gas Cyprus may discover through existing pipeline systems to Egypt, and then be in essence dependent on the existing Egyptian LNG liquefaction facilities being brought back into use. But that is not an issue that is in Cyprus's control. That's an issue that depends on the Egyptian domestic market.
Do you think it would be feasible? We keep talking about whether we should have our own liquefaction system here in Cyprus, or is the investment in something like that really not going to be feasible for the returns?
You would have to have an answer to one of two questions. The first question is, can you do it on the existing resource basis? And the answer is only if you had phenomenal cooperation of the kind that we have never ever seen before on a cross-border basis, in this case between Israel, Cyprus and indeed possibly Egypt. That's the only way you could get the quantities of gas at present to justify an LNG plant, and frankly that's not going to happen. If you had major new discoveries, things that would dwarf the discovery of Aphrodite, then you could contemplate it. But those discoveries have not been made. And even if they are made, it would take an awful lot of time. I don't think there is any realistic prospect of LNG in Cyprus for export for an awful long time. The only prospect I see for gas exports is in effect to piggyback on whatever Egypt decides to do. There is the consistent talk of building a pipeline that would connect all the East Med facilities to Greece and then on to Italy. From an energy security point of view in Europe, this would be fantastic, but the costs would be very high. I would be surprised if they came in at less than 6 or 7 billion euros, and it might be a lot more than that. Under current circumstances, think who has got the money for that or the interest, and the answer is virtually nobody.
And dare I say, I think the elephant in the room is Turkey, with our EEZ and its continental shelf, and of course the whole political situation in the region.
Several points need to be made. The first is that Turkey cannot prevent the initial exploration and production of gas in, to use a sort of rather blunt phrase, the waters that are controlled by the internationally recognised Republic of Cyprus, i.e. I'm talking about the southern part of the island. But that's where the gas is, and so I don't really see Turkey, no matter how many warships it puts into the area, actually being able to stop production. That really would cause a massive international dispute if it tried to do so. But it's a different point when it comes to the EEZ issues to the west of Cyprus. Turkey probably has a pretty good case that if it wished to go to law on it, that it has an EEZ to the south that would extend until it reached the EEZ of Egypt. The case for arguing that Greece has an EEZ that extends eastward until it meets the Cypriot EEZ is, I think, much weaker. It depends very much not only on the status of Castellorizon, but on the status of Megisti, the little islet off Castellorizon, giving them full rights to territorial waters and EEZ. This would be hard to maintain in international law. Not impossible, but very hard. And I think the Turks would probably manage to say, no, you can't have it. But what this really means is, if you want to lay a pipeline, you have to take Turkish interests into account. That actually could be a good thing. But it very much depends on what kind of general attitude Turkey takes. And if one was to see Turkey taking a cooperative attitude, and after all, in many ways, Turkey is the one natural market for gas in this region. It should be thinking cooperatively. But the tensions in Cyprus itself are such that I believe that unless we can get a solution to the problems of the island and be well on the way to reunification, you are not going to see either a gas line from the East Med straight to Turkey, which would be a logical commercial development, but nor, I think, on political grounds, would it be easy to develop a pipeline going across the Eastern Med all the way to Greece and then on to Italy. But I think actually the fundamental reason why you won't see that kind of long pipeline to Greece and Italy is probably commercial.
Staying with that energy conference, William Powell was another of the speakers. He's editor-in-chief at Natural Gas World, and he's here to tell us what he was putting across to the conference.
The main strand of the argument was that while there is an awful lot of gas in the world, there will still be occasions when there are going to be peak prices, particularly in the winter months. This is because Europe is losing its biggest sources of swing gas, which is the Groningen gas field in the Netherlands. That's losing its output either for regulatory or for geological reasons. It could be down to almost zero, depending on which way the court goes in November. The UK is losing its swing from its fields because they're all in decline. It's losing possibly the interconnector, which is a big pipeline flowing gas to and from the UK and Belgium, which is an important part of the flexibility portfolio as well. which will mean that LNG will be the biggest source of swing gas in the UK, particularly if the interconnector contracts aren't renewed post-2018. So there's a lot of uncertainty in the market. Traders will tell you that this price is all factored into the uncertainty. However, there's no guarantee that we won't be exposed to very high prices, depending on our ability in Europe to outbid other buyers of that LNG who may be offering more money for different reasons for delivery into Asia.
And the role of Turkey and of Russia in all of this?
Russia is a hugely important gas producer for the European Union. We are, in some parts of the European Union, very keen to encourage gas imports from Russia through Nord Stream 2. In other parts of Europe, such as Eastern Europe, we are very anxious to deter Russian imports. So there's a sort of split response in Europe towards the growth of Russian gas. However, Russia needs the money, and we are able to buy it, and Russia is able to undercut competitors, particularly from the US. So its role is likely to stay the same and grow. At the very worst, stay the same. At best, it could grow quite a lot. Turkey remains an important market for Russian gas. It could also become an important transit country once the pipeline from Azerbaijan is operational sometime in 2020. Whether more gas from Russia flows through Turkey into Europe, that will remain very much a question for the European buyers to decide how much they want it, how much cheaper it will be than other sources of gas, what European gas demand in general is going to be. These are all very big unknowns, particularly as new technologies make natural gas have to compete more with new technologies, some of which are going to be subsidised on price, bearing in mind the European Union's goals for decarbonising.
The final panel at the Eastern Mediterranean Energy Conference was on energy transition and renewables in the area. And Julian Popov, who is a fellow of the European Climate Foundation, was one of the speakers. Julian, first of all, what is the European Climate Foundation?
So it's probably one of the largest independent European organizations that is working on a low-carbon energy transition, low-carbon energy policies and industry policies.
So are you responsible to some degree for the targets that the European Union is setting?
We're not responsible for them, but we're obviously working quite a lot on the targets and on many other issues, and all the regulations and all policies that are related to reducing the carbon emissions, but we're very much focused on the economic viability also to this transition.
And how do we see this transition taking place? I mean, most of the conference has been about gas, pipelines, availability, saleability and so many other things, but where does this whole idea of renewables fit into the picture?
Well, it depends very much where we are. When we're in Cyprus, when we're in East Mediterranean, obviously the idea of the very large discoveries of gas deposits takes over the debate. And then the big debate is, can we extract this gas? Can we sell it? Can we build the pipelines and all that? We don't talk much about the alternatives, but the alternatives are, for this region, very, very obvious. They don't have that possible geostrategic role that we might see in gas, but they could be absolutely vital. The Southeast Europe in general is probably the richest area of Europe of renewable energy.
Because of the sunshine?
Because of the sunshine, because of the wind patterns, the hydro potential, biomass, which is controversial, but still we have to put it there, and also because of all this capacity is already being addressed. Quite a lot has been developed in countries like Greece, Bulgaria, Romania. So this capacity is proven, and it already plays a major role in the energy picture in the region.
I'm wondering how far many countries assess the potential of renewables, particularly when, like Cyprus, they seem to be laying all their hopes on huge hydrocarbon finds. Does it, in a sense, mean that they tend to put renewables on the back burner without having assessed properly what potential that could be in economic terms?
Yes, the economic picture is changing constantly because of the rapidly falling cost of renewables. Because of that, my advice is always to reassess the opportunities all the time. So you can't just have a report today and this report to be valid in 10 years. It's not even valid next year. Assessments that we have made last year are already completely out of use because cost has changed. So in that sense, it is very important to constantly compare the different options. One thing about renewables is that it could be incrementally deployed. So you can put a solar panel that costs 20 euros and you start producing and using electricity. You can't extract gas for 20 euros. You have to invest 5 billion or 10 billion in order to start your first use of this energy resource. So in that sense, renewables are moving in paths that are very unpredictable and they're moving in very quickly. So, yes, the region is very rich of renewable resources. It's very rich of very low and falling cost renewable energy resources. And the big question is how exactly Cyprus will make the best use of them.
And that was Julian Popov, a Fellow of the European Climate Foundation and also Chairman of the Building Performance Institute Europe and former Minister of the Environment of Bulgaria.
Keep up to date with events in Cyprus and around the world with the Cyprus News Digest.
We spoke recently on the programme about a fascinating conference that took place in Nicosia on archaeology and heritage of Cyprus, organised by the University of Westminster's Cyprus Centre. And one of the speakers, talking about displaying Cypriot heritage outside the island, was Thomas Keeley of the Cyprus collection at the British Museum. Thomas, how did you get involved with not only the Cyprus collection at the British Museum, but the Cyprus Centre and the work that it's been doing over the years?
Well, I've been looking after the Cyprus collection at the British Museum for about 11 years now, and part of this involves engaging with various cultural community centres around London in particular, and I met John Charalambous there a number of years ago, and we started talking about ways that we could collaborate in presenting and making more popular Cypriot heritage in general. And I was very happy to do this because one of my key jobs at the British Museum is to make people more aware of ancient Cyprus, its archaeology, its culture, its heritage. And the British Museum has a wonderful collection of artefacts from the island. So it was a natural collaboration, I think, in the end.
It's got a wonderful collection. How much appeal does that have to the public when it comes to the British Museum, the visitors to the museum? Is it one of the popular areas where they go to? What sort of things do they see?
Well, we get 6.5 million visitors a year, and I hope that a few of them at least stop in the Cyprus Gallery. The Cyprus Gallery is one of the newest in the museum because it was recently refurbished with the help of the Leventis Foundation. What they come and see is a sample of about 10,000 objects from Cyprus which we have. You can see things ranging from the 5th and 4th millennium BC down to Roman times. You can see some of the finest pottery, jewellery, glass, ivory work made in the Eastern Mediterranean in antiquity. You can see the inventiveness of ancient Cypriot potters, who were some of the most clever and creative, inventive pottery makers in the region. You can see how Cyprus is part of the Eastern Mediterranean world more generally. You can see the trading connections, the settlement of peoples, the conflicts right throughout its history. So you get the Eastern Mediterranean in a nutshell with Cyprus at its centre.
Of course, some people might say, what's all this doing in the British Museum? Because I think a lot of artefacts were illegally removed from the island by diplomats, no less, in the, 18th and 19th centuries.
Well, there were huge amounts of excavations and collections made by the expatriate community, but also by the local Cypriot community as well. And in particular consuls, as you've said. Whether they were illegal or not is a more interesting point, because at the time there were no strict laws governing antiquities. It was only really over the course of the 19th century that people began to realise the importance of preserving antiquities on the island. Other excavations took place under these new rules, and I think what has happened between the 19th century and the 21st century is a change to the idea that no antiquity should leave the island at all. It was very common in the past to operate what's known as partage, where basically the fines would be divided between the government, the excavator, maybe the landowner, because the landowner was seen to have a share in the fines that came out of the ground as well. So it's a very complicated picture. We emphasise nowadays that if you have antiquities in your collection, and in the UK there are dozens of museums with antiquities, you should display them and study them and explain them to the general public. So,
well, I suppose since you were talking at that conference in Nicosia about collections outside of Cyprus, you could answer back that actually, if all of these things stayed in Cyprus, an awful lot of people wouldn't know anything about it because they have to come to the island to see them. Whereas if they are in famous museums around the world, then it's a way of reaching out and taking Cypriot heritage and archaeology out into the world.
Absolutely, and we're very lucky in the British Museum because we have such a global collection that we can show Cyprus on its own terms, but we can also show Cyprus connected with other parts of the world. So I look after the ancient Cyprus collection predominantly, but we also have Byzantine collections which are shown in the early medieval gallery, and we have later medieval collections which show the 13th and 14th centuries AD and so on. So you can actually show how Cyprus has played a role in the Eastern Mediterranean throughout its history. And you're absolutely right to say that if there are collections outside of the island, people will come and see them. I hope, for example, that the many British tourists who visit Cyprus every year might look at museum collections of Cypriot antiquities as a way of reminding themselves of their wonderful visit to the island, thinking a bit more about the history and culture. And also, it's a very important issue to educate people about the importance of not taking antiquities out of the island today, which of course is completely illegal now, and rightly so. And I think it's very important to educate people about the importance of preservation and about how fragile archaeological heritage can be, because after all, we know through development, through conflict, through environmental damage, that the historical past is very vulnerable. And I hope that museums are able to remind people of the importance of antiquities as a source of historical knowledge, but also as a way of inspiring people to think about the past and think about places like Cyprus.
And think about how that past impacts on the future and the present day. That was Thomas Keeley from the Cyprus collection at the British Museum.
In collaboration with the Cyprus Mail, this is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
The Porsche Carrera Cup was held at Brands Hatch last weekend, and it was a thrilling finale to a pretty good year of racing. The final round of the season saw Cypriot driver Dio Elinas finishing third and ending the season on a high. After the race, he spoke to Josh Peacock.
Tio, what a way that is to finish your season, 4 podium positions in a row. Talk me through that race.
Yeah, it was a good start from the beginning. Went from P4 to P3 in Druids, so it was good gain. So then concentrated just to stay with the top guys, and just literally we're all identical lap times all the time. It was one gap and it was the same all the time. So I was trying to push a bit more, and then I had some moments, so I just played it on the safe side. I've seen it was drizzling a little bit, so it was really hard around sector 1 and sector 2, so good end.
It was a short period of time, maybe you were closing in on Dino. Could there have been more there, do you think?
Yeah, it could have been more. I was chasing for that first win, but it was not bad to end the season. I mean, 5 podiums within the season, so not bad.
Overall then, I know we've already spoken about this today, but you are pretty satisfied now, especially with the second half of your season, with your first year here in Carrera Cup?
Yeah, I am. Just looking forward, if I can find the sponsors to come back again and do it next year.
Cypriot racing driver Dio Elinas speaking to Josh Peacock from Lloyd Bell Productions. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.